Hello, welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Aloud. This is a little blue book. I know it's red, but the title at the top you can see says Little Blue Book, and this happens to be Little Blue Book number 1170, Funny Ghost Stories Told After Supper by Jerome K. Jerome. And we left off on the end of page 29. Page 30 starts a new story. The Doctor's Story. It made me cry very much, that story. Young Biffles told it with so much feeling. We were all a little thoughtful after it. And I noticed even the old doctor covertly wiped away a tear. Uncle John brewed another bowl of punch. However, and we gradually grew more resigned. The doctor, indeed, after a while became almost cheerful, and told us about the ghost of one of his patients. I cannot give you his story. I wish I could. They all said afterward that it was the best of the lot, the most ghastly and terrible, but I could not make any sense of it myself. It seemed so incomplete. He began all right, and then something seemed to happen. And then he was finishing it. I cannot make out what he did with the middle of the story. It ended up, I know, however, with somebody finding something. And that put Mr. Combs in mind of a very curious affair that took place at an old mill once kept by his brother-in-law. Mr. Combs said he would tell us his story, and before anybody could stop him, he had begun. Mr. Combs said the story was called The Haunted Hill, or The Ruined Home. Mr. Combs' story. Well, you all know my brother-in-law, Mr. Parkins, began Mr. Combs, taking the long clay pipe from his mouth and putting it behind his ear. We did not know his brother-in-law, but we said we did, so as to save time. And you know, of course, that he once took a lease of an old mill in Surrey and went to live there. Now you must know that years ago this very mill had been occupied by a wicked old miser who died there, leaving, so it was rumored, all his money hidden somewhere about the place. Naturally enough, everyone who had since come to live at the mill had tried to find the treasure, but none had ever succeeded, and the local wisecracks said that nobody ever would. Unless that ghost of the miser Miller should, one day, take a fancy to one of the tenants and disclose to him the secret of the hiding place. My brother-in-law did not attach much importance to the story, regarding it as an old woman's tale, and unlike his predecessors, made no attempt whatever to discover the hidden gold. Unless business was very different then from what it is now, said my brother-in-law, I don't see how a miller could very well have saved anything, however much of a miser he might have been. At all events, not enough to make it worth the trouble of looking for it. Still, he could not altogether get rid of the idea of that treasure. One night he went to bed. There was nothing very extraordinary about that, I admit. He often did go to bed of a night. What was remarkable, however, was that exactly as the clock of the village church chimed the last stroke of 12, my brother-in-law woke up with a start and felt himself quite unable to go to sleep again. Joe, his Christian name was Joe, sat up in bed and looked around. At the foot of the bed something stood very still, wrapped in shadow. It moved into the moonlight, and then my brother-in-law saw that it was the figure of a wizened little old man. in knee breeches and a pigtail. In an instant the story of the hidden treasure and the old miser flashed across his mind. "He's come to show me where it's hid," thought my brother-in-law. And he resolved that he would not spend all his money on himself, but would devote a small percentage of it toward doing good to others. The apparition moved toward the door. My brother-in-law put on his trousers and followed it. The ghost went downstairs into the kitchen, glided over and stood in front of the hearth, sighed, and disappeared. Next morning, Joe had a couple of bricklayers in and made them haul out the stove and pull down the chimney, while he stood behind with a potato sack in which to put the gold. They knocked down half the wall. They never found so much as a 4-penny bit. My brother-in-law did not know what to think. The next night the old man appeared again, and again led the way into the kitchen. This time, however, instead of going to the fireplace, it stood more in the middle of the room, and sighed there. "Oh, I see what he means now," said my brother-in-law to himself. "It's under the floor." Why did the old idiot go and stand up against the stove so as to make me think it was up the chimney? They spent the next day in taking up the kitchen floor, but the only thing they found was a 3-pronged fork, and the handle of that was broken. On the third night the ghost reappeared, quite unabashed, and for a third time made for the kitchen. Arrived there, it looked up at the ceiling and vanished. He don't seem to have learned much since where he'd been to," muttered Joe as he trotted back to bed. "I should have thought he might have done that at first." Still, there seemed no doubt now where the treasure lay, and the first thing after breakfast they started pulling down the ceiling. They got every inch of the ceiling down, and they took up the boards of the room above. They discovered about as much treasure as you would expect to find in an empty quart pot. On the fourth night, when the ghost appeared as usual, my brother-in-law was so wild that he threw his boots at it, and the boots passed through the body and broke a looking-glass. On the fifth night, when Joe awoke, as he always did now at 12, the ghost was standing in a dejected attitude, looking very miserable. There was an appealing look in its large, sad eyes that quite touched my brother-in-law. After all, he thought, perhaps the silly chap's doing his best. Maybe he has forgotten where he really did put it, and is trying to remember. I'll give him another chance. The ghost appeared grateful and delighted at seeing Joe prepare to follow him, and led the way into the attic, pointed to the ceiling, and vanished. "Well, he's hit it this time, I do hope," said my brother-in-law, and next day they set to work to take the roof off the place. It took them 3 days to get the roof thoroughly off, and all they found was a bird's nest. After securing which, they covered up the house with tarpaulins to keep it dry. You might have thought that would have cured the poor fellow of looking for treasure, but it didn't. He said there must be something in it all, or the ghost would have never kept on coming as it did, and that, having gone so far, he would go on to the end and solve the mystery, cost what it might. Night after night he would get up of his bed and follow the spectral old fraud about the house. Each night the old man would indicate a different place, and on each following day my brother-in-law would proceed to break up the mill at the point indicated and look for the treasure. At the end of 3 weeks, there was not a room in the mill fit to live in. Every wall had been pulled down, every floor had been taken up, every ceiling had had a hole knocked in it. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the ghost's visits ceased, and my brother-in-law was left in peace to rebuild the place at his leisure. What induced the old image to play such a silly trick upon a family man and ratepayer? That's just what I cannot tell you. Some said that the ghost of the wicked old man had done it to punish my brother-in-law for not believing in him at first, while others held that the apparition was probably that of some deceased local plumber and glazier who would naturally take an interest in seeing a house knocked about and spoiled. But nobody knew anything for certain. Interlude. We had some more punch, and then the curate told us a story. I could not make head or tail of the curate's story, so I cannot retell it to you. We none of us could make head or tail of that story. It was a good story enough, so far as material went. There seemed to be an enormous amount of plot and enough incident to have made a dozen novels. I never before heard a story containing so much incident, nor one dealing with so many varied characters. I should say that every human being or curate had ever known or met or heard of was brought into that story. There were simply hundreds of them. Every 5 seconds he would introduce into the tale a completely fresh collection of characters accompanied by a brand new set of incidents. This was the sort of story it was. Well, then, my uncle went into the garden and got his gun. But of course it wasn't there. And Scroggins said he didn't believe it. Didn't believe what? Who's Scroggins? Scroggins? Oh, why, he was the other man, you know. It was his wife. What was his wife? What's she got to do with it? Why, that's what I'm telling you. It was she that found the hat. She came up with her cousin to London. Her cousin was my sister-in-law, and the other niece had married a man named Evans. And Evans, after it was all over, had taken the box round to Mr. Jacobs, because Jacobs' father had seen the man when he was alive and when he was dead. Joseph, now look here, never you mind Evans and the box. What's become of your uncle and the gun? The gun? What gun? Why, the gun that your uncle used to keep in the garden, and it wasn't there. What did he do with it? Did he kill any of these people with it? These Jacobes and Evanses and Scroggins and Joffuses? Because if so, it was a good and useful work, and we should enjoy hearing about it. No, oh no. How could he? He had been built up alive in the wall, you know, and when Edward the Fourth spoke to the abbot about it, my sister said that in her then state of health she could not and would not, as it was endangering the child's life. So they christened it Horatio, after her own son, who had been killed at Waterloo before he was born. The Lord Napier himself said, "Look here. Do you know what you are talking about?" We asked him at this point. He said, "No." But he knew it was every word of it true, because his aunt had seen it herself, whereupon we covered him over with the tablecloth, and he went to sleep. And then Uncle told us a story. Uncle said his was a real story. The Ghost of the Blue Chamber. My uncle's story. "I don't want to make you fellas nervous," began my uncle in a peculiarly impressive, not to say blood-curdling tone of voice. "And if you would rather that I did not mention it, I won't. But, as a matter of fact, this very house in which we are now sitting is haunted." "You don't say that," exclaimed Mr. Combs. "What's the use of your saying I don't say it, when I have said it?" retorted my uncle, somewhat peckishly. "You talk so foolishly. I tell you the house is haunted regularly on Christmas Eve. The Blue Chamber. They call the room next to the nursery the Blue Chamber at my uncle's, most of the toilet service being of that shade, is haunted by the ghost of a sinful man, a man who once killed a Christmas wait with a lump of coal." "How did he do it?" asked Mr. Combs with eager anxiousness. "Was it difficult?" "I did not know how he did it," replied my uncle. "He did not explain the process. The wait had taken up a position just inside the front gate and was singing a ballad. It is presumed that when he opened his mouth for B flat, the lump of coal was thrown by the sinful man from one of the windows, and that it went down the wait's throat and choked him." "You want to be a good shot, but it is certainly worth trying," murmured Mr. Combs thoughtfully. "But that was not his only crime. Alas," added my uncle, "prior to that he had killed a solo cornet player." "No! Is that really a fact?" exclaimed Mr. Combs. "Of course it's a fact," answered my uncle testily. "At all events, as much as fact as you can expect to get in a case of this sort." "How very captious you are this evening. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The poor fellow, the cornet player, had been in the neighborhood barely a month. Old Mr. Bishop, who kept the Jolly Sandboys at the time, and from whom I had the story, said he never knew a more hard-working and energetic solo cornet player. He, the cornet player, only knew 2 tunes, but Mr. Bishop said that the man could not have played with more vigor or for more hours a day if he had known 40. The 2 tunes he did play were Annie Laurie and Home Sweet Home, and as regarded his performance of the former melody, Mr. Bishop said that a mere child could have told what it was meant for. This musician, this poor, friendless artist, used to come regularly and play in this street just opposite for 2 hours every evening. One evening he was seen, evidently in response to an invitation, going into this very house, but was never seen coming out of it. "Did the townfolk try offering any reward for his recovery?" asked Mr. Combs. "Not a halfpenny," replied my uncle. "Another summer," continued my uncle, "a German band visited here, intending, so they announced on their arrival, to stay till the autumn. On the 2nd day from their arrival, the whole company, as fine and healthy a body of men as one would wish to see, were invited to dinner by this sinful man, and after spending the whole of the next 24 hours in bed, left the town a broken and dyspeptic crew. The parish doctor, who had attended them, giving it as his opinion that it was doubtful if they would, any of them, be fit to play an air again. You don't know the recipe, do you?" asked Mr. Combs. "Unfortunately, I do not," replied my uncle, "but the chief ingredient was said to have been railway refreshment room pork pie." "I forget the man's other crimes," my uncle went on. "I used to know them all at one time, but my memory is not what it was. I do not, however, believe I am doing his memory any injustice in believing that he was not entirely unconnected with the death and subsequent burial of a gentleman who used to play the harp with his toes, and that neither was he altogether unresponsible for the lonely grave of an unknown stranger who had once visited the neighborhood, an Italian peasant lad, a performer upon the barrel organ. "Every Christmas Eve," said my uncle, cleaving with low, impressive tones the strange, odd silence that, like a shadow, seemed to have slowly stolen into the settled down upon the room, "the ghost of this sinful man haunts the blue chamber in this very house." My walls are blue. There, from midnight until cock-crow, amid wild, muffled shrieks and groans and mocking laughter and the ghostly sound of horrid blows, it does fierce phantom fight with the spirits of the solo cornet player and the murdered, assisted at intervals by the shades of the German band, while the ghost of the strangled harpist plays mad ghostly melodies with ghostly toes on the ghost of a broken harp. Uncle said the blue chamber was comparatively useless as a sleeping apartment on Christmas Eve. "Hark!" said my uncle, raising a warning hand toward the ceiling while we held our breath and listened. "Hark! I believe they are at it now, in the blue chamber." I rose up and said that I would sleep in the blue chamber. Before I tell you my own story, however, the story of what happened in the blue chamber, I would wish to preface it with a personal explanation. And I think we'll stop there.